I want to do a little bit of overview on this whole colonial middle thing before we get going into it, before we read this chapter, because I thought it was kind of curious. You might be asking yourself by now, I don't know if you're asking yourself this, but you might think, wait a second, I signed up for colonial Latin America, and all I'm reading about is like indigenous people and Aztecs and African Atlantic. Like, are we finally there? Because I would say that, in the traditional textbook, if you had a class called Colonial Latin America, you would have said a few things about somebody, but you start the thing off in 1492, and then I'd have you memorizing a bunch of Spanish names and kings and all that stuff. And all the Spanish stuff. That was what is colonial Latin America was supposed to be, versus what we've done here. We've had 3 chapters that are like prequels, which are before colonial Latin America. We had 4 conquest chapters, one of which was about the Aztec and the Inca. And then we start the colonial middle, but we're starting out with native communities and Black communities. And so it's like, wait a second, where's all the colonial Latin America stuff? Now we are getting there, but I guess what I want to say about this is that, first of all, I actually think it's a good perspective, a smart perspective on this. But what I want to impress upon you is that when we do history, we we always are sort of looking at history from the viewpoint of, well, what's going on today? And as circumstances today change, people tend to think about different elements of the past. And so I think in the first class, I made the quip, the joke that the good thing about teaching colonial Latin America is it all happened. You don't have to stay up to date because it's all over and done. And so you just keep teaching the same. You don't have to have the latest textbook. Who cares? It's all done. It's all history. And so, but that's not completely true. And so one of the reasons I think this material has become re-examined is the reemergence of indigenous peoples and movements throughout the continent. I'm just going to choose a couple examples that are kind of close to my heart. The 1990 Levantamiento Indígena del Inti Raymi in Ecuador. Ecuador, before this time, imagined itself to be a place where you're sort of a mestizo or a white class of elites ruled over the country, and that they were civilizing all the indigenous or Indians into being being a modern place. And in 1990, the indigenous peoples basically took over the whole country, blocked the roads, did massive protests, shut the country down, and ever since have become a major player, periodically shut the country down in Ecuadorian life. I say this close to my heart because in 1990 to 1991, I spent a year in Quito, Ecuador as a study abroad program. And when I arrived, people were just, the people in Quito, in the capital, were basically in shell shock, because it's like the idea that after 500 years, right? Let's just put a round number on it, that there'd be indigenous people taking over an entire society or entire country was just, they couldn't imagine it. It was a huge transformation in their life. They would have never imagined the people, imagining that somebody of indigenous heritage, Evo Morales, would become the president of Bolivia would have been, it wouldn't have even existed in people's minds that people could think about this, ruling elite of Bolivia, that there'd be an indigenous person who would be democratically elected to be the president of this place. And this has happened in country after country, not all, of course, but it's been a huge resurgence in political awakening. So let's say, oh yes, that, in many Latin American countries, the fact that they have these strong indigenous political movements, the fact that there has been, you know, African American leaders and Black autonomy, or you might say self-governance, means that you have to think about this history, that the idea that everything was kind of that all these people were eliminated during the colonial period is just untrue. And so the fact that the thing is that historians have to go back and rethink these myths about, what we talked about in the last class, the myth of completion or the myth of pacification, the idea that all these communities were simply submerged under the great Spanish rule. So we have, however, come to this period they call the Colonial Middle, and this historical puzzle. Apparently, the historians have been thinking about this for a long time, and that's basically the theme of our class today, is the relative stability of colonial rule under the Spanish Habsburgs. Basically from, say, the 1550s up through 1750s. Huh?
Habsburg jaw, right? Oh, yeah, because they were all inbred. Yeah.
Yeah.
The line dies with Charles II.
Yeah, see, I don't know that because we're not doing that European history here. We're concentrating on the Latin American part of it. So something happens over there. Yeah, they're probably all marrying each other and being weird in the core areas. So around those sort of heavily settled areas of the Inca and Aztec Empire, Ryan, there's something else happening on the periphery or the autonomy, those areas out there. What's happening out there in the hinterlands, we might say? Are they being all stable and cool? Not really. No, there's still places where, remember in the last class, we talked about these places which were never really conquered or they sent successive, there's a lot of this area of the periphery during this period that is very much under, they're basically doing conquest type stuff and fighting each other for this whole period. But in this, what we might call the colonial core for this period, we're gonna say, yeah, see, I don't know however long until we get to that guy that you guys are talking about, around the end of the conquest battles, let's say the 1550s until roughly maybe a little later than that. They're not getting into independence yet. Bless you. So the debates here are, we might say that during this period from, say, 1492 up until this period of relative stability, is that there was these pitched battles over who's going to control this territory. Is there going to be colonialism at all? And these battles are still going on during this time in other parts of the Americas. But in much of this core area, people aren't fighting over whether there should be colonialism or not. What are they fighting over? Really a debate about whether or not the Spanish were going to rule. It's whether or not they're doing the right thing. And at the beginning of the chapter, it's a fights over whether it's being managed correctly or not. Blatant mismanagement, people doing the wrong thing. They often start fighting, James, because why? What do those colonists bring with them that they're letting out and just eat animals? Lots of animals, lots of new hungry animals like cows and other things that just wander, rogue animals. And so if you lived in a society where you never had to fence off your garden, and now you have these big cows tromping around, this was one of those big debates in there. No, they also got upset, or people would get upset if they were forced to do things. Right. So debates about, because although slavery was technically illegal for the indigenous peoples, under Spanish rule. As they said here, I think they said that something like rules were meant to be broken. The rules seemed made to be broken. It's a stupid rule. But anyway, the rules seemed made to be broken. So in these areas, there were places that were where it was pretty close to enslavement or various forms of forced labor. Now, we come back, again to this issue that the Spanish didn't want to eliminate the indigenous population because that was the people they depended on to basically survive. And as Lane and Restall and Lane say, basically the Spanish state becomes a giant parasite, kind of above or over here, basically trying to suck out the resources, but not, if you're a parasite, you don't want to kill your host. You want to keep the host going, but just kind of suck off the top, suck out some resources and get something out of it. So during this time, there's still, of course, rebellions and revolts, but the main fight seems to be about how this whole colonial system is going to work, not about whether it was going to be or not. Now, long puzzled over the stability. One of the other curious things about the stability issue is because it seems like the Habsburgs had developed what they call the chain of appeal. A pretty, if you look, I wasn't able to reproduce this, but if you look on page 153, it's a legal system in which you start at the bottom, you're just a person, an individual. And so they give the example of this very famous author, indigenous person, Ramon Poma de Ayala, who basically writes a long letter that would later become a whole book. And it's, a huge complaint about colonialism. And, his point is the first new chronicle and good government. He's trying to sort of talk about the way it was during Inca times and the way it should be. But his individual complaint then rises up to the level of the cabildo, or kind of the town. But then from there, you could go up to the corregidor, or the alcalde mayor, the big mayor, you might say. From there, you might go up even another level, the audiencia, the viceroy, all the way up to the Council of the Indies, which would be the people who manage the whole Indies. And from there, you could even make it up to the king. I'm not sure if Juan Poma de Ayala made it all the way up to the king, but the interesting point is that anyone, hypothetically, could make their case and it could go up pretty high. And you could appeal it, and if you could show that, your case had merit, and you could go pretty high up there. You might not want to go all the way to the king, because apparently he looked pretty silly at this time. But you could get there, and the king might decide in your favor. And so what's also interesting about this is that apparently as they say, Native American subjects, as on page 45, learned to exploit the colonial system to their advantage. So they were actually using this legal system a lot to try and get various redresses to the things that they were entitled to. And then on page 149, in that little box, they talk about the role of the scribe in Native American communities, and that Spaniards often complained about how litigious the Indians were. So this is often, a complaint that the Spaniards had, is that they're always taking us to court. Now you can see, you saw this also a little bit, remember in the film when they were talking of that, historian was talking about the siege of Lima, and the heirs of Pizarro went and took a court case and said, hey, we need more money because we spent it all defending from the siege. And the crown came in and brought their witnesses in who said this other story about how the siege occurred and that they didn't owe you money because these indigenous peoples were the ones defending the city from this other attack. And so there's a lot of for those of you who are really interested in historical records, this is a way to get a much different perspective than the chronicles and some of the Spanish historians as you go into these legal cases. And there's a ton of information. You just have to get to the documents and know how to read it. But it gives us a very different perspective on the conquest. Now, of course, this system it isn't that everybody's getting everything they want. As Restall and Lane put, there's a couple problems here. One is that to really get from the individual all the way up to the king, that was a pretty long road to take, and there's sort of geographical and political distance that might take years to have happen. And if you're having all these people, composing court cases, you have this case of information overload. So it's really interesting, though. I think it definitely did channel a lot of the complaints during this period, and people thought that they had a method to redress some of the imbalances of the system. Now, of course, James, we don't want to overstate how nice these colonial processes were to these communities. What happened with these congregations? Yeah, so there's a lot of, we might call, well, what they call damage done when they just try to organize everybody and put people together in different places. So we don't want to underestimate that. And at the end of the last class, I was saying we do have to take into account how many people perished and how much destruction there was, and how we do have a lot of monolingual Spanish speakers, for example. So there was a lot of damage done from this. But as they point out, even when they would sort of try to organize everybody into one place, and they do a lot of damage, but then over time, people usually tried to drift back into their local settlement patterns. I mean, they would change things, add in new ingredients. I mean, indigenous societies are, they're not, there's different food, using basically indigenous food patterns, clothing, language, but changing. I mean, the societies are not locked in time either. They would incorporate different things. And I think in the last class, I may have overemphasized the Catholicism of Latin America, because really what people did is they would convert to Catholicism, but as you said, they would choose a particular saint or a particular brand, and mix in some examples from, mix in some of their own religious symbolics into there. And you end up with these kinds of blends. And yeah, people would actually, the Catholic Church was not always excited about the way people interpret, or the sort of the higher ups were not always excited about the way people use Catholicism in Latin America. I mean, in some ways, to this day, we might say. For example, people criticize them for different places and whole countries for exalting the Virgin Mary to a point above Jesus, almost like they were basically worshiping Mary. And I mean, I think, I don't know how Protestant you want to be, but it's like Catholicism is wonderful because you have all these people and saints, and you can kind of pick and choose which one you want for yourself and your town and get all excited about. The Protestants only have a few people to really, and so what the indigenous people were accused of from the higher ups is like that they hadn't really converted to Catholicism. They were still doing their indigenous stuff just with the names of all these other, and that they were basically continuing to be polytheistic, or whatever, within this religion. So there's a lot of leeway or room for. And by the way, this applies with various African American, we'll read about a little bit in the next chapter, African American traditions that blended Catholicism with African deities, and some which are quite alive today. At the very end of this chapter, or right before the Philippine counterpoint, it says that, nearly all the great churches of Spanish America, the region's most tangible and often admired colonial heritage, were built by native carpenters, stonemasons, plasterers, and painters. Some were even architects. And so we'll see a little bit of this in the mission, how much, in fact, people embraced Catholicism and made it their own, but they really did make it their own in ways that the higher ups were not always happy about. So I think, Pluto, you mentioned this, the dividing line was not, the dividing line for many of those communities was being part of the community and outsiders. And it didn't matter where the outsiders were coming from. The outsiders might be your neighbors next door who were moving into town, or people, or new people. But it wasn't necessarily this line between all the Spaniards and all the natives. People in these areas saw this as us versus different outsiders. Now, on the positive side of this, of course, we can emphasize how much, obviously, Indigenous people were able to manipulate the system, make choices within it, have their own perspective, their own spin on things, take people to court, do the legal system, etc. What might be a cynical perspective on this? If you were a cynic and you were looking at this situation from the viewpoint of the Spanish higher-ups, this idea that you've now encouraged all these people to, yeah, you do your own thing. Yeah. Spin is, oh yeah, people are, are able to be autonomous, independent. The cynical spin is, it's a method. It's the classic method of colonial rule. You just keep people dividing and squabbling amongst each other. You keep them divided into those little Republicans and little Democrats fighting each other, and then you never have like true systemic change. You just keep rerunning the same election over and over. Yeah, that's true. Back. So, one of the interesting things about this is how important, of course, the top rung, the native elites were in maintaining these, again, they weren't completely autonomous, but they were pretty autonomous. They were semi-autonomous communities. And they were often able to continue, their leaders would come from the same people who had been leading them before the conquest. So, it was basically they were allowed to keep the people who had been in charge. Even some of them are known as caciques. What's a cacique, Pluto? A female chief or a female ruler. So in some of these cases, there was a lot of, in pre-Hispanic society, there was a lot of female authority and political. And this meshed, remember when we talked about that, this kind of meshed with what was going on the Iberian Peninsula as well, with the power of some of inheritance and some of the political, the queens and other figures. So they were sometimes able to keep things going in that way. Now, like intermediaries in every situation, they were they had to basically keep colonialism going, Spanish survival, but they also were keeping their community alive. And so they were kind of playing this role where if they gave out enough tribute, if they basically met the demands of the Spanish, then they could keep their people going and semi-autonomous. And this worked for a long time, and they were able to kind of play this intermediary role. There'd be a breaking point later, which we'll eventually talk about, which is part of the reasons why this society moved toward independence, because you had, there becomes a serious divide between the people who are basically leading and ruling and making money off their own communities, and so they get squeezed by this issue. So we've been puzzling like the historians over this long period of stability. We've seen how the native elites are one of the key issues in being able to navigate the system. We've seen the persistence of different customs and traditions and the ways in which they're able to create their own version of Catholicism. We've seen the legal system in order. In this chapter, I'm going to make the claim that one of the other factors, which I think paradoxically, they don't talk about it this way, helped keep things stable, were these frontier boom towns. Now, I first want to say that these are places where resources would be discovered, and then all these people would flood in and build a place, and then they'd, basically get all the stuff they could, and then it would go bust. Classic boom and bust cycle. They talk about the Caribbean pearls and pearl divers, Colombian gold, and the Argentine cattle. And basically, again, what would happen in these places is you discover something, and then, yes, for the most part, there were just a lot of people brought in and made to dive for pearls, or made to round up cattle, or made to pan gold, or whatever it was. And so we don't want to overlook the ways in which there's a lot of damage, including environmental damage, done in these places. But the best things you want to do is, if you have a boom town going on where everybody's diving for pearls or panning gold, is you go in and you sell them the pans, or you sell them the food, because everybody's trying for the gold. And if you can come in and maybe get a job or sell people things, it produces a range of opportunities for other things to develop there. The other thing is, it's kind of like, you ever see people playing the lottery? It's like everybody knows the lottery is, the lottery actually is a tax, right? I mean, but like, who's doing it? You go down to any gas station and it's like, this idea that you might win. You can't win if you don't play. And so in these towns, it's like, it's like there are these, every so often somebody might find the biggest pearl ever, the biggest nut of gold, and they're going to go out and make it big. And so I guess what I'm saying is these places look like unstable areas, but the idea that they could give you social mobility in some ways keeps the system in place. It's you're still thinking you might win.
Kind of how the system of conquistadors worked as well.
Yeah.
Go out there and die, but I might have an estate.
I might, yeah, I might make it. Yeah, no, good point. So we have this, we have again this period of relative stability. There are things that happens that Chris Lane, and I mentioned this before, talks about more in his book, which came out after this. Maybe he was saving it for his later book, The Silver City That Changed the World. He talks a little bit about Potosi in this chapter, or they do. But this mountain was originally kind of a boom town. So originally it was like discovered, and everybody panned out or basically mined out the easy silver ore. But then they developed techniques to extract the ore from deeper in this mountain. And so it became a huge city that drew people from all over the world to it, and produced, I think, something like half or 2/3 of the world's silver supply. So an enormous amount of currency, an enormous amount of wealth. Again, for the most part, this went to people who were not in it. I think I might have given a wrong page number there. It's supposed to be page 151. I don't even know if it's that. Page 156, but I'm also thinking of that part back to Josie, you asked about the public works project in Mexico City.
Lake Mexico.
Yeah, so in this book, Lane says that there was a public works project in Potosi to basically move in all this move in all these canals in order to develop the mills that would mine the town. And he says here that that endeavor was a huge public works project, the only one of its kind in the Spanish colonies, with the exception of the drainage of Lake Texcoco to protect Mexico City from seasonal flooding. So you asked if there were any others. This was the only other one. But in general, yes, the Spanish were not very interested in large public works projects that would help other people or help the people themselves. They were more interested in being the giant parasite on top of the system, like getting tribute. Every so often they would do something if it seemed like it would help them to keep things afloat, but basically they were relying on indigenous infrastructure and them building the places that were there. So this again, but I think that the production of silver from these mines in what is now Bolivia, and also they talk about the mines in what is now Mexico, helped to create a lot of stability during this period because it was a resource that you could keep drawing upon and keep funding the enterprise.